"All right, Michigan, you're up," Charity whispered, roughly tugging at Stella's blanket in an attempt to wake her up. But Stella was already awake, her eyes sore from having not slept for 2 nights. "I'm up," said Stella, taking a few deep breaths before jumping down from her bunk. "Not getting cold feet now, are we?" Charity asked, throwing an arm around Stella roughly as the two snuck their way out of the dormitory. It was almost 3 a.m., and wandering along the halls of the dormitory at any time past lights out was seen as trespassing and subject to disciplinary actions if they were to be caught. The girls were making their way to the abandoned chapel by the borders of the academy, banned from every student by the school's head mistress on the grounds of confidentiality. Diane had come up with an idea to go camping in the rumored haunted chapel for the night, which was not a first for them. But tonight's was special. It would be Stella's welcome party to their small gang. Despite the term they had tagged it, she felt rather obligated to attend them out of free will. "You know we don't have to do this," Stella almost pleaded, her voice shaky as they approached the chapel. She could see 2 figures ahead and concluded that they must be Diane and Martha. "I mean, you can see the blood moon tonight, right?" At once the 2 girls stared at the sky, the moon appearing a dark shade of red as the night grew darker. The clouds were heavy and the wind seemed to increase with each second that passed. A storm was coming, and to Stella, it was a harbinger of doom. Yet Charity shrugged. "It's just a lunar eclipse. You can read up on it when you get back. It's not that deep," she said. "What's not so deep?" Diane asked. Stella stared at the brunette, admiring her beauty yet remembering how cruel she could get if she wanted. Always having the power to do and undo since she was a politician's daughter. It was no surprise she had control issues. Even the nuns at the school could not do much about Diane for fear of her father pulling his donations from the school funds. "Michigan was just worried about the lunar eclipse tonight," said Charity. "You mean the blood moon," Martha corrected. She was as superstitious as Stella, if not more so. Out of the trio, Martha was the most normal. It surprised Stella how someone as kind as Martha associated herself with the likes of Diane and Charity. Whilst Diane was a control freak, Charity, on the other hand, lived up to her name, but not in the way one would expect. She bullied almost every student by taking their provisions from home forcefully. It was indeed a fearful thing to not pay homage to Charity by the start of the term. Yet as Stella stared at Martha now, it was evident that she was not like her peers. Martha was not a bully of any kind, but she was antisocial. She wasn't the most friendly, and due to the reputation of her friends, this accosted her little interaction with the rest of the girls at the school. Yet she didn't mind that no girl tried to speak to her as she walked down the halls. She didn't mind that there were whispers and murmurs whenever she grabbed a book from the library. She didn't care that the other girls didn't like her because of the company she kept. Still, as long as you could stand her rude tone, Martha would lend a helping hand if she could. "Oh, please, Mart, not you two," Diane laughed. Stella could see the items placed by her feet: a mat, a few candles, a lighter, and multiple veils. She figured they would be using them for the welcome party. Charity had told her about the urban legend they were going to try out. The Bloody Mary game, and Stella was not looking forward to any of it. "Honestly, I agree with the freshmen when I say we should leave this thing for another night. We've never done this under a blood moon before, and that's enough bad omen as it is already. Talk less of conjuring a freaking demon." And as she finished her statement, the wind picked up slightly that they all held onto themselves from the cold. "Lunar eclipse, Martha. It's a natural phenomenon. Don't tell me you believe all those stories," Charity scoffed. Martha didn't reply. She only gave Charity an upsetting look before glancing at the freshmen amongst them. Stella was barely in the moment as she stared into space, pondering on how she had gotten herself into this mess. It was one of two options. Either become friends with the three most infamous girls at St. Mary's All-Girls Academy, or inevitably become their victim. Most girls were not lucky enough to have a choice, and fell into the latter category by default. But Stella deemed herself lucky when she had lent a helping hand to Diane on her first day of admission. Already transferring from a school where she was previously bullied, Stella was not willing to risk another year of torture. She wasn't sure her family would believe her story of bullying this time around. How could she have the guts to tell her family that she would be the victim of another set of bullies when she had made them move all the way from Michigan to a small town in Canada? "Are you two done so we can start the party?" Diane asked sarcastically before turning to Stella. "Hope you're as pumped up as we are," she smiled crookedly at her. "Yeah," she lied, nodding as her heart pounded in her chest. She had read all about the Bloody Mary game and hoped it was not as spooky as the internet portrayed it to be. The sky thundered again as the rain began to pour violently. The wind howled as it blew, shaking the zinc roofing like an unknown force threatened to pull it apart. The entire chapel was pitch black, and the trickling sound of leaking pipes and scrawling rats were added background noise to the loud drumming of the roof. Charity switched on the torch light as she led the way down the broken and condemned wooden pews on either side of the aisle. At the altar stood a broken statue of the Mother Mary tilted to one corner. Her face and hands still intact, but the rest of her body had broken off into irregular bits and pieces, like something had gnawed its way through repeatedly. Lightning flashed across the sky and cast a shadow on the statue at the same moment that Stella stared at it, and she could almost swear that the Mother Mary smiled at her. She shrieked, jumping at once and throwing her arms into the air. "Jesus Christ!" Martha gasped, holding her chest. "Michigan, what the hell?" Charity chided. "You almost gave me a heart attack. Jeez." "But the statue, it..." Stella stuttered, unsure of how she would sound if she said the statue of Mary just smiled at her. "We haven't even started and you're already scared," Diane laughed. Charity also chuckled, but Martha remained impassive. She stared at Stella, who stared back at her, her expression filled with horror. Martha looked unsettled, staring at the statue once more before looking away immediately. Stella thought to herself, Did she see it too? "I think I'll pass on tonight's camp. I'll keep watch outside and let you know if anyone's coming. You guys can have fun," Martha said, heading for the exit. She could not shake the bad feeling that came over her any longer. She would wait for them till morning, in a nearby shed at the entrance of the chapel. Stella wished she could leave with her, but she knew that this was only wishful thinking. "Chicken," Charity mocked, laughing with Diane as they walked past the statue and entered the bathroom down the hallway. Stella avoided staring at the statue this time, bending her head as she followed Diane's lead. The bathroom was as dilapidated as any of them would expect, But by the corner of the wall stood a large mirror, unbroken, yet hazy with dust. It looked odd as it stood against the surrounding broken doors of the stalls, the broken window pane close to the ceiling, and the dust-covered floor, littered with dead leaves that flew in from the open window. The girls had taken a position in a corner of the bathroom away from the mirror. Diane spread the mat on the floor before they sat down in a small circle. Charity switched off the torch, flicking the lighter repeatedly as she proceeded to light a candle. "Okay, who wants to go first?" Diane asked, handing Stella her lit candle and a veil. The small section close to the wall where they had sat lit up dimly. "Stella?" Diane asked. "I'm sorry, I don't know how to—" "How is it done?" Stella asked. "It's simple. All you have to do is go stand in front of that huge mirror over there." Diane pointed to the mirror by the corner. "While holding your candle, you stare into your reflection and say the phrase, 'Bloody Mary,' 3 times. It's super easy." "But can I ask why?" Stella muttered. She still could not understand the reason behind doing this. She remembered begging Diane if there was anything else she could do, but she had insisted it was their friendship initiation ritual, stating how it took guts to be part of their crew, and one way of doing that meant doing something daring. Diane chuckled. "Stella, you have to be fearless, and that takes a huge amount of guts. We all know the legend of the Bloody Mary is super scary, but not everyone has the guts to confirm that. Which is why we chose to do this. Our friendship is about taking risks and succeeding at it. Unless you've decided that you don't want to be friends." "I want to," she immediately replied. "I want to, Diane." She had already come so far. She couldn't let it all go to waste. "Then watch and learn." Diane smiled her famous crooked smile. She grabbed a veil and a candle and went across to the mirror. Stella stared wide-eyed in awe as the wind seemed to pick up in speed. Diane wrapped herself with the veil, letting it fall over her head. From behind, she looked like a nun to Stella. Guarding the flame of the candle, Diane stared into her dim reflection in the dust-covered mirror on the wall. The other 2 girls arched their necks, each wanting to see how Diane would perform. Stella could feel her heart pound excessively in her chest, and it wasn't even her turn yet. "Bloody Mary," she began, her voice a deadly low, and the wind suddenly grew calmer, as if it also yearned to listen to the chant. "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, answer my call." The bathroom fell silent, every eye glued to Diane's reflection in the mirror. They waited a few seconds for anything to occur. According to the legend, once you said the phrase 3 times, a ghost would appear shortly and try to kill you. But as the girls stared on in anticipation, nothing but rain and dust flew into the room. Diane laughed before spinning around. "See? Nothing. Charity, you're up. Let the freshman go last. I think she might give us quite the show." Charity got up, and just like Diane, she grabbed her items and chanted the phrase in front of the mirror. The group waited for a few minutes for something to happen. Yet again, it was evident that it remained just the 3 girls in the small bathroom. "Okay, Michigan, you're next." Stella could not help but feel a mixture of relief and disappointment. She had expected to see a ghostly apparition of the Virgin Mary or something demonic in the mirror or in the room, or even hear a faint voice of laughter in the distance. But the only laughter came from the two 13-year-olds she had tried to make her friends. Perhaps the urban legend was nothing but a scary story after all. She got up, wrapped her veil, and held her candle close, guarding against the wind that had surprisingly remained calm through the duration of their little game. She looked up at her reflection in the mirror. Everything looked normal. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, answer my call. Stella froze. Her eyes stuck to the reflection in the mirror. Everything remained the same as it had been before. Yet, she had noticed something for the first time since she started. At the far corner of the bathroom, right next to where Diane and Charity sat and laughed amongst each other, stood a dark silhouette. "What's wrong, Stella?" Diane asked. "Guys, can you not see that?" she asked, unsure, turning back to the girls, but surprised to find nothing in the corner. Thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, she turned to face the mirror once again, and there it was a second time. The strange dark figure. But this time, a bit closer than before, that she could get a better look at it. It looked like a person, dressed in a dark cloak, with a thick veil that ran all the way from their head to their feet. Their dark arms clasped together, and stationary, almost like a statue. Stella tried to speak again, but she could not get the words to reach her quivering lips. Her pupils had dilated to be sure she was seeing what she was seeing. What seemed to terrify her the most was the fact that neither Diane nor Charity could see what she was seeing. Slowly, she turned again towards her new friends to be sure the mirror wasn't playing tricks on her. Probably it was her imagination getting the best of her, or a distortion in the glass. Yet, when she turned again, it was only the two girls at the end of the bathroom, still sitting on the mat, candles faintly burning as they laughed at something together while pointing at her. Her ears still rang, making the sounds muffled that it felt like she was underwater in a swimming pool, and the girls were speaking above on the surface. "Stella!" Diane yelled again, and she finally heard. "Okay, I think we should call it a night before you fall into shock," she laughed, standing up to her feet. "I agree," said Charity. "I'm not willing to get scolded by Sister Ada on why the new student can't speak in the morning." Stella could feel a slight moment of relief and concluded that it was probably her imagination. Of course, the only statue was the one at the altar of the chapel. It was probably her mind playing silly tricks with the poor lighting in the room. She sighed, a small smile reaching her lips. But when she'd turned back to the mirror one last time, the image she'd seen had made her entire being run cold with petrification. The dark figure had now emerged right by her side, crouched down and tilted as it rested its neck on her right shoulder. It wrapped its long, human-like fingers around her arms that Stella could suddenly feel their icy nature. The sensation had made her shock so intense that her arms almost went numb. She froze, shivering, trying with great effort to move her head away and scream for help. But she felt paralyzed by some unseen force, held in place by the ominous presence as she was forced to stare at the reflection of not just herself, but that of the latest presence in the room. Slowly, it raised its head, the dark veil pulling backwards with each second and she could almost see the outline of a face. Suddenly, Stella's hands began to move of their own accord. She watched in terror as she slowly began to bring the lit candle closer to the direction where the figure had stationed by her side, as if it wanted her to get a better view of its face. She struggled, but in vain. Her entire body was no longer hers to control. Her eyes were glued to the spot, her head unmoving, as if another pair of hands held them in place, forcing her to see what she saw next. It was the face of what she would have once considered a woman's, but it looked too beautiful and surreal to belong to that of any woman she had ever seen. The skin was porcelain white and looked like it had been carved from the smoothest of stones and the best of sculptors. However, her eyes were closed and she remained unsmiling. At that moment, Stella had thought that she oddly reminded her of the Mother Mary. Instantly, the air grew colder, and her once numbed skin had reactivated as the grip from the woman's long nails now dug into her skin. Stella winced, watching in pain as the woman's once kind and beautiful features suddenly transformed into the most terrifying image she had seen in all her existence. The woman's eyes blasted open and curved into slits, black and void, and it felt like Stella was staring right into the center of hell. Her mouth curved open, revealing her spike-like numerous teeth, so many that she could barely count. "You called for me," a sinister voice whispered in her ear. "Here I am." The woman bit into Stella's neck, using her sharp teeth to pierce through her slender skin with ease. Stella began to scream hysterically, dropping the candle as she held onto her neck and fell to the floor. Diane and Charity stared in shock at Stella's display. They rushed to her side, Charity grabbing her arms and trying to keep the girl from harming herself as she thrashed violently on the floor. "Stella," Diane called to her. But Stella did not answer. She kept screaming, and her body kept shaking violently. "What's wrong with her? Did she really go into shock?" Diane asked, confused as to what was going on. She, Stella stuttered. "Bit me." "What?" Charity asked, also in confusion. "What is she saying?" "She said someone bit her?" Diane answered, but the two girls could not find any bite marks nor signs of physical harms on her. Stella's fit became more violent as her eyes rolled to the back of her head and she began foaming at the mouth. "Oh my God, she's having a seizure. Quick, help me," Charity said with all urgency. She bent to pick her up, grabbing her arms, but frowned when she looked up to find Diane unmoving. "Diane, what are you doing? Come help me pick her up. Let's get her to the "No," Diane muttered. "And what are we going to tell the sisters when they ask us what happened to her? That we were busy fooling around in the Forbidden Chapel? That would expel us." "I don't know. We could lie or something. And when she eventually wakes up, who is she going to say forced her to come down here for this silly welcome party?" Charity blinked in confusion. "We can't just leave her here to die. You don't even have to be scared of anything. Your father would never let them expel you." "I've got one strike left. One strike. And then I'm shipped off to repeat the entire junior school somewhere off in India. I've basically been living off of past glory here. And I don't know about you, but I'm not ready for any of that." "So what, we leave her here to die?" Charity asked, staring at her convulsing body in guilt and fear. "We just leave her here. It's not like anyone knows she came here with us." At that moment, Stella ceased all movement as her body became dangerously still. Charity fell to the floor and brought her ear close to Stella's face. "Diane?" she said, her voice shaking. "She's not breathing." The room fell quiet for a moment before Diane spoke. "Let's go while it's still raining. The storm will cover our tracks." She tugged at Charity's arm, pulling her till they both got their things and left the bathroom. Charity still couldn't fight the bad taste that filled her mouth. She knew she had done some bad things in the past, but never like this. Never had it bordered on the line of death. I can't do this," Charity said, shaking her head. The girls were almost halfway to the chapel entrance, the lightning still flashing across the sky in the thunderstorm. "I'm going back for her. There's a chance she might still be alive." And she ran towards the bathroom, leaving Diane in the hall. She could hear Diane's voice from behind, but it sounded further than it should have been. Not paying her any mind, she arrived at the bathroom, determined to carry Stella to the infirmary. She reasoned Martha would lend a helping hand once she saw what had happened. Charity was not sure which emotion overpowered the other, if it was more dismay or confusion, as she arrived to discover an empty bathroom. She switched on her torchlight, pointing it to the exact spot they had left Stella just a few seconds ago. Yet Stella's body was nowhere to be found. Thinking the freshman had regained consciousness, Charity began calling after her, kicking open the bathroom stalls to see if Stella was probably throwing up in one of them. Yet there was no sign of the girl. Suddenly, the main entrance to the bathroom slammed shut. Diane pounded against it from the other side, struggling with the door handle as it refused to open. Charity struggled on her end, her eyes almost welling up with tears as she could not understand what was happening. The air in the bathroom instantly dropped a few degrees. She held on to herself, wondering where the intense cold could have come from. "Charity," a voice called, and it sounded a lot like Stella's. "Michigan? Where are you? Stop fooling around." Still, all she heard was her name. It seemed to come from one of the stalls. Sure that Stella could not have been in any, she approached with caution before kicking the door open. Again, no Stella. Yet, she knew she was not alone. A violent wind blew across the bathroom stall, and it felt like the temperature had dropped to below 0. Charity could barely feel her fingers as her limbs began to grow numb. Scared now, as she could not comprehend what was happening, the strange voice beckoned to her again. "Charity, Charity, Charity, Charity." She backed up against a corner, flicking her torch from one direction to the next as the cold intensified with each passing second. Though it still rained heavily outside, she was sure it was not enough to cause the blizzard that had enveloped this small bathroom. The cold felt like slow fire that burned from her toes to her fingers and everywhere else on her body. "Who is there? Show yourself!" Charity cried, panting as her torch began to give out. It flickered slowly, growing dim as she repeatedly smacked it against her palm. When the light had given out, she ran towards the door and banged, crying to Diane for help as the cold almost choked her voice from sounding out. On the other side, Diane kept struggling with the handle, pushing against the door as she could not understand what was going on. She could hear Charity's screams and feel the intense cold on her side of the metallic door and the small space between. Suddenly, Diane could hear the piercing scream that made her slam her hands against her ears in reflex. She had never heard Charity sound so terrified, to the point that she could feel her own heart racing with fear. After a few seconds, the air grew quiet. The door pried open on its own, making Diane take a step back. She instantly felt like turning on her heels and running for the exit, but she needed to know what happened to Charity. Slowly, she pushed the door open and gasped as an ice flake settled on her nose. Charity's torch was left switched on by the coroner and gave her the opportunity to view how the once normal bathroom that they had laughed and played the silly, scary story in had now magically transformed into an iced cave. Icicles formed all over the ceilings, and a few on the ground that resembled the stalagmites she'd seen in a documentary. The floor was completely iced to the point that she could not walk properly without the risk of falling. How did this happen? Diane asked herself, staring in awe and horror as the room appeared both beautiful and terrifying in the illumination from the dim torchlight. But her admiration was cut short when she bumped into something as she walked, tripping her as she slid to the icy floor. Diane shrieked, scrambling backwards as the light fixed on two white orbs, wide with terror and frozen in place as they stared into Diane's brown eyes. It didn't take her long to realize that it was Charity. Her petrified expression was frozen in place as she took the pose of someone who looked like the last thing they had seen was a ghost. Her right arm was held up in the air as if trying to guard herself against whatever might have attacked her. "Oh, Charity," Diane cried, rushing to her friend but being too afraid to touch her. Confused and scared beyond her mind, she knew the events of the night were too absurd to be considered normal. First, Stella's hysterical fit before her seizure, and then the mysterious shutting of the bathroom door, which felt more like something was trying to prevent her entry. And now, the impossible reality of Charity being frozen to death in the middle of August. She shook her head. The events of the night were certainly caused by something strange, something ominous. She reasoned that they were being attacked by some unseen force. Perhaps the chapel was indeed haunted, or could it still be the silly urban legend? She didn't want to wait around to find out. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed the flickering torch and ran for the exit, screaming Martha's name repeatedly as she cried out for help. But Martha had since fallen asleep in the nearby shed she had taken cover in from the rain. Diane was appalled to find the chapel door shut and proving difficult to open. Just like the bathroom door, she kicked, pushed, struggled against the frail door, but the wood wouldn't give way. Raising her fists, she pounded violently against it, screaming out Martha's name and crying relentlessly for help. But the storm that raged on outside had acted as some form of soundproof to the activities that occurred in the chapel that night. Then Diane could hear what sounded like footsteps behind her. She fell still, her heart threatening to escape her chest as the footsteps slowly approached her. But she was not prepared to go down easy. Before the torch could give out, she quickly picked up a nearby plank and braced herself with it, backing up and taking a defensive stance against the entrance door. The sound of the footsteps increased, and at the same time, her torch gave out. She was enveloped in complete darkness, yet she knew she was not alone. Somewhere underneath, she knew the plank in her hands would do her no good. Her eyes flicked from corner to corner, unable to comprehend the darkness, especially when she knew what hunted her could see her very clearly. No longer able to keep up the facade, she dropped the plank and began to run in no particular direction. Her mind had been filled with utmost terror as she played back the image of what became of Stella and Charity, and all for what? A stupid game? Lightning flashed across the sky and illuminated the chapel for only a moment, giving Diane the chance to see a way out through a broken window. But it also provided the chance to notice the silhouette that stood in the middle of the aisle. She ran towards the window in the dark, stumbling into some pews and stools, incurring slight scratches and scars from the obstructions in her path. Lightning came to her aid again, lighting up the path to her escape, as well as showing how much closer the figure was to her position. Diane cried almost at the edge of the window pane before feeling a tight grip on her ankle. She fell head first into the floor, looking up to see the last image of the blood moon, before getting dragged into the darkness behind her. Her screams were drowned out by the thunder that roared in the sky. The storm had lasted all through the night and finally subsided in the early hours of the morning. The chirping of the birds had been what woke Martha from her long slumber. Stretching like a newborn, she wondered how she slept for so long in such an awkward position. Gasping, she remembered where she was and rushed into the chapel in search of her friends. Yet there was no sign that anyone was ever in there. Did they ditch me and scram? She thought, confused as to how the chapel remained dusty and dull, with no signs of invasion the previous night. Thinking the girls had returned to their dorms, she headed for the exit, but not before risking another glance at the creepy statue of the Virgin Mary at the altar. She remembered how she thought she had seen it smile at her the previous night, noticing how Stella also reacted, like she had seen it as well. Yet, now that she stared at the lifeless figure, she realized how silly she must have been. Yes, the statue couldn't have possibly smiled at her. Not when the statue did not even have a face.